The funeral director called me aside. We've buried 6 people from your apartment building this year. Nobody else seemed to notice the pattern. I was standing there in my black suit at Mrs. Kowalski's funeral, trying not to think about how she'd been my upstairs neighbor for only 3 months. Arthur Valdez, the funeral director, gestured for me to step away from the other mourners. His face looked strange, not the usual professional sympathy I'd seen from him twice before this year. Can I speak with you privately? Arthur whispered, glancing around the viewing room. We walked to his office behind the chapel, and he closed the door carefully. Look, I don't know if this means anything, but you're from Riverside Gardens Apartments, right? Building C? I nodded, confused why he was asking. Arthur opened a thick ledger on his desk and ran his finger down several pages of entries. We've buried 6 people from your exact building since January. Mrs. Kowalski makes it 7. My stomach dropped. 7 people dead in one apartment building in 10 months? I lived in a 32-unit building, which meant nearly a quarter of my neighbors had died this year. Arthur kept talking, his voice getting quieter. The thing is, most of them were relatively young, healthy people in their 40s and 50s, heart attacks, strokes, that sort of thing. But the frequency is what bothers me. He showed me the dates written in his careful handwriting. January 15th, March 2nd, April 18th, May 30th, July 12th, August 25th, and now October 8th. Has anyone else mentioned this pattern to you? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Arthur shook his head slowly. That's what's strange. Usually when there's a cluster of deaths like this, families start talking, health department gets involved, but each family acts like their loss is isolated. Nobody connects the dots. He pulled out a manila folder and spread out several death certificates. Look at these addresses. Unit 3B, 5A, 2C, 4B, 6A, 1C, and now 3C. It's like someone's going floor by floor. I felt dizzy staring at those addresses. Mrs. Kowalski lived directly above me in 3C. The woman in 2C had died in April. I remembered the ambulance, but I'd been traveling for work and never learned details. Arthur, why are you telling me this? He leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. Because you live in 3A, and if this pattern continues, he didn't need to finish. I was surrounded by units where people had died. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the timeline Arthur had shown me. Deaths roughly every 6 to 8 weeks since January. I started making a list of everyone I could remember seeing in the building hallways over the past year. Mrs. Kowalski had moved in around July. Mr. Singh from 5A had always seemed healthy when I passed him checking his mailbox. Janet from 2C used to walk her dog every morning until she didn't. I worked as a data analyst for an insurance company, which meant I knew how to recognize statistical anomalies. 7 deaths in a 32-unit building over 10 months was roughly 22% mortality rate, which was completely impossible for a general population. Even nursing homes didn't see death rates that high. I pulled up actuarial tables on my laptop and ran the numbers 3 different ways. The probability of this happening randomly was less than 0.001%. Something was definitely wrong. The next morning, I decided to talk to Diane, who lived in 4A and had been in the building longer than anyone. She was probably the closest thing we had to a building historian. I knocked on her door around 9 a.m., hoping I wouldn't seem too strange asking about dead neighbors. Diane invited me in and offered coffee, which I accepted because I needed the caffeine after lying awake all night. Diane, I know this might sound weird, but have you noticed how many people in our building have died this year? She set down her coffee cup harder than necessary and stared at me for a long moment. You mean you've been paying attention too? Her voice had an edge to it that surprised me. I've been wondering if anyone else would notice. It's been eating at me for months. Diane walked to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a small notebook with dates written inside. I started keeping track after Mr. Singh died because it felt like too much of a coincidence. She showed me her list, which matched Arthur's almost exactly. The thing that bothers me most is how they all seemed fine until they weren't. Mrs. Kowalski was taking groceries up the stairs just last week. Janet was planning a vacation. These weren't people who seemed sick. We spent the next hour comparing notes about each person who'd died. Almost all of them had lived alone, which meant no one was monitoring their day-to-day health closely. Most had seemed isolated from the building community, keeping to themselves and not socializing much. There's something else, Diane said, lowering her voice even though we were alone. I've noticed the same maintenance guy has been in the building more often this year, usually doing work in the units right before or after someone dies. My blood went cold. What kind of work? Diane shrugged. HVAC repairs, he said. Something about upgrading the ventilation systems. But I've lived here 8 years and we never needed that much maintenance before. She gave me a phone number written on a scrap of paper. His name is Garrett Walsh. He works for the property management company. Always very polite, but there's something about him that makes me uncomfortable. That afternoon, I called the property management office and asked about recent maintenance in our building. The woman who answered seemed confused by my questions. What ventilation upgrades? We haven't authorized any major HVAC work in Building C this year. She put me on hold and came back 5 minutes later. I'm looking at our records and we don't have any Garrett Walsh on our maintenance staff. Full story on my channel and linked below.